David Benger is a third-year JD student at Harvard Law School. At Harvard, David is the chapter president of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights and the Law, and the events chair of the HLS Alliance for Israel. He's also an editor on the Journal of Law and Public Policy and the HLS National Security Journal. Previously, David was an investigative analyst at the New York DA's Major Economic Crimes Bureau, a judicial intern in the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, and a legal assistant on a trial team at the International Criminal Court. David earned a Bachelor of Arts in Politics and Russian Studies from Brandeis University and a Master of Arts in Global Affairs from Tsinghua University in Beijing. Is my pronunciation correct of that institution, David?
Tsinghua.
Thank you. Where he studied as a Schwarzman Scholar. His commentary has been published in the Boston Globe, the New York Daily News, Lawfare, Times of Israel, and elsewhere. Now that's what it says about you on paper. What I would just like to tell everybody here is that for several years, we've had the privilege of bringing our speakers to Harvard Law School. And during your time in situ as one of the leaders of the Friends of Israel organization there at Harvard Law School, you have always said yes, and you've always hosted. And I want everybody to understand that beyond what's written about you is a tremendous character and tremendous caliber of individual, because when one goes to a Harvard Law School or frankly any other top tier university to pursue any other qualification, one goes there, yes, for the qualification, but also for contacts. And being forthright and open and outspoken and brave and of conviction on the subject of the state of Israel can understandably cause a compromise in the number of contacts one is able to make, not just during the course of one's university career, but also in one's professional and even public life. And yet you raise your head time and again. You've hosted, as in front of your peers, you've hosted generals and ambassadors and members of Knesset, and you've also always done so with great aplomb and tremendous professionalism. And I'm very appreciative of that. And I'm proud to have you as one of our adjuncts at the MirYam Institute. And I thank you for everything you've done on behalf of the States of Israel throughout your legal studies, I'm sure prior to that, and I'm certain beyond that, because one of the things that we know is that you are one of a generations deep family of Zionists and Israel supporters. So thank you very much indeed. And before I really do throw the ball into your court, I want to thank everybody else for dialing into this conversation. It's going to be a little bit different. I want it to be a personal conversation. And I want to try and highlight things that one wouldn't necessarily read about in the media and things that I frankly haven't been able to speak about hitherto in terms of my professional endeavors. So with that, David, it's over to you and reiterated thanks.
Well, Benjamin, thank you so very much for that overly kind introduction. I wasn't expecting it, and it's made me a little bit emotional, so I'm grateful for that. Thank you. I'm very excited to be here, and I'd like to second your welcome to all of the viewers who are tuning in live and all the listeners who will be listening to the recording in the future. I would like to begin sort of at the tail end of the story. You ran an organization called Our Soldiers Speak, which you yourself founded, which brought many speakers who had extraordinary experiences to campuses and other settings. And you decided to transition from Our Soldiers Speak to this new organization, which you are running now, called the MirYam Institute. Can you talk a little bit about your decision to make that transition? And then we'll go back and talk about the founding of Our Soldiers Speak a bit later. But first of all, I want to talk about, sort of situate us where we are right now. What is the MirYam Institute, and why we're here?
Yeah, absolutely. So first and foremost, when I say that I'm the co-founder of the MirYam Institute, I do mean the co-founder. And therefore, my partner in the work that I undertake is Rosita Panini. And she and I made the decision that it was time to move. I very much believe that in life, you have to know when to move, you have to know when to adjust, you have to know when to pivot, and you have to know when to answer a call, even if you would prefer that that call was not coming. And so I founded Our Soldiers Speak very shortly after my service in the Second Lebanon War. will talk about that. Through that organization, as many of the people know here on this call, we had the high privilege of being the only organization globally through which the Israel Defense Forces, Israel National Police, and even various branches of government would dispatch active senior ranked members to preeminent campuses such as your school and other peer schools, also to brief members of Congress, members of the Senate. We even briefed the administration, I hope we'll come to that a little bit, on the Israel-Palestinian conflict. And the reason that we were doing that was that at the time of the founding of Our Soldiers Speak, there was a problem. And the problem was students hated Israel. That was basically the problem. And we wanted to combat that, and we wanted to combat that by bringing the most qualified individuals to do so. People who weren't reading headlines, gathering facts, drawing on evidence that was in the public domain, but actually drawing upon their own personal experiences and able to talk about their experiences from the field. During the course of that work, all the way up to January of this year, we saw other threats emerging. And those other threats included a rapid rise of overt anti-Semitism, specifically in the United States of America, which is the point of highest concern for us. We also saw a rapid rise of anti-Israel sentiment within the Jewish community, again, specifically, most worryingly, in the Jewish community of the United States of America. And we also saw a complete division of opinion among the pro-Israel community. So to give you an example of that, we saw that you couldn't get a right-of-center Jew to listen to a left-of-center Israeli without labeling that left-of-center Israeli a traitor. And you couldn't get a left-of-center diaspora Jew to listen to a right-of-center Israeli without labeling that right-of-center Israeli a fanatic. And the reality is none of that is true. And as we've seen various political dynamics become more and more polarized, the subject of the State of Israel has actually fallen in line. So whether it be composition of the Supreme Court, whether it be women's rights, reproductive rights, whatever it may be, as things have become more and more polarized and various parties have retreated to various corners and they've taken their donors and their donations with them, and they've become all the more tribal, issues relating to the State of Israel have fallen in line with that dynamic. And we felt that we needed to tackle those three things, in addition to the slander of the Israel Defense Forces. So we've not cast aside any of our initiatives. We're actually doing more of those initiatives, COVID-19 notwithstanding. And we wanted to create an umbrella organization into which Our Soldiers Speak would slot very, very nicely. So we still send uniformed officers to speak and to lecture, but through which we could take on these debates about Israel's future, through which we could host people from the State of Israel and people throughout the diaspora, whether they're on the left, center, or right of the political spectrum, and have them engage with the State of Israel through the MirYam Institute. And so our credo is Israel's future in Israel's hands. I'll come to that in one moment. But our goal always was that wherever you are politically and wherever you were physically, as long as you were not anti-Israel, you could engage with the State of Israel via the MirYam Institute. So if you want to write, you can do that. If you want to read, you can do that. If you want to watch or screen a video, you can do that. If you want to attend one of our live events, you can do that. And if you want to listen to a podcast while you're walking your dog, you can do all of that through the MirYam Institute. So wherever you are politically, wherever you are physically, you can engage through the MirYam Institute. We do have some red lines. Anybody who is anti-Israel or wants to debate the right of the State of Israel to exist is not welcome within the Institute, and we will not give any air to their particular opinions whatsoever. And that's actually written in our manifesto on our website. And we also wanted to make sure that Israel's future stays in Israel's hands, meaning we want to ensure that Israel leads the conversation about its future. Israel's experts lead the conversation about its future, because after all, it's the people who live in Israel who will have to live with the outcomes of the opinions that they espouse. So that's what the MirYam Institute is. We launched in January of this year, and we did so just in time because we wanted to be present even when we weren't physically able to be on the ground. Nobody saw the coronavirus pandemic coming, obviously, at the point of our launch, but we haven't missed a step. Actually, we've been putting out wonderful content, engaging conversations, high-level analyses. We've reached the media, the international media, policymakers, and so forth, and we're just getting going. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you, Benjamin. And so I just want to note for our viewers that this interview is kind of unusual in that many of the MirYam Institute's interviews are about policy and they're about recommendations regarding politics or other issues. This is actually quite a personal look into your life. So in that spirit, I'd like to go back in time a little bit and ask about your upbringing and what brought you to this point and what made you such a tireless warrior, both literally and now in your other work for Zionism. We could just talk about, you know, your faith journey and how that intersected with your interest in Israel.
Yeah, so that's a very broad question. Before I go into it, I want to say a word to everybody who's out there, and I'll start with the very personal. And you used this phrase, we'll start at the end point. So I want to start at the end point of my service in the Israel Defense Forces. When I concluded my service, I was a veteran of the Second Lebanon War of 2006. I had served for the cause of something for which I was willing to lay down my life, quite literally. And after I concluded my time in Lebanon, I also served for several months in Hebron. I served along Israel's northern border, and I've done multiple tours of reserve duty subsequently, and I was also drafted in 2012 and 2014. But after I finished my conscripted service, or the service for which I initially volunteered as a conscript, I flew back to the United Kingdom. And I flew back to the United Kingdom to undertake a post-baccalaureate pre-medical course. So I had my BA in American History, Literature and Politics from the University of Manchester, went to Israel, served, joined the IDF, had the privilege of everything that entailed. And then almost immediately after, I returned to the UK to pursue this post-baccalaureate pre-medical program because I'd watched the medics tend to the wounded, and that had inspired me to live a life of purpose. And I decided I wanted to be a doctor. And I did that in Manchester, David. And within the space of a 6-7 hour flight, whatever the duration of the journey from Israel to the UK is, I went from a place where I was full of purpose, absolutely clear of what I was doing and why I was doing it, totally welcome among my people, speaking a language that I was passionate about and that I learned in the military, to a place where nobody knew what I had done and absolutely nobody cared to know what I had done in the military, and a place that was very, very hostile towards Israel and very, very hostile towards the Jews. And I'm talking specifically to the institution at which I studied. And I remember that period, that year, being a period of total darkness and grayness and a complete absence of all animation and purpose. I got through the studies and I made it. And I actually was admitted to medical school. I didn't have any talent pursuing those subjects. I got it through putting my head into the materials very, very intensively. But I do remember that the purpose for which I had lived felt as though it had been snatched away from me. And I think that many, many people are perhaps undergoing that feeling now, that they've worked and they've had a purposeful life and they're not quite sure what tomorrow will bring, and they don't quite know what their day will look like in the near term, much less the long term, the distant term. And despair can set in. And I just want to tell everybody, whatever you feel, however down you may be, hold on. Don't give up. Keep going. Continue. Remember the great deeds that you've already achieved, and work hard during this time so that when opportunity comes, not knocking, but as it did in my case, pounding on your door, you're ready to seize hold of it and grab hold of it and ride it for all that it's worth. So I just wanted everybody to know that, you know, people don't like to talk about their down times. I'm very comfortable doing so. I've experienced many of those times, and I know that others are going through that. But just hold on, keep going. In terms of my upbringing, I was raised in the United Kingdom. I was born into an Orthodox home. I grew up in a beautiful leafy suburb called Alwoodley in northeast England, in a city called Leeds. The non-Jewish members of the community around us used to call it All Yidley, not All Woodley, but All Yidley, because every single home just about belonged to a member of the Jewish faith. It was a strong Jewish community. When I was born there were about 24,000 Jews. I think today there are maybe 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 Jews, certainly not more than that. I didn't realize quite what a beautiful place it was to grow up in until I'd served in the Israel Defense Forces and served in some very, very difficult places. I am one of 7 children with 6 sons, 1 daughter, as several people here know. And I was raised in the Orthodox tradition. It always chafed, and I chafed within that tradition for various reasons. But one thing that I was never, ever torn about was my fondness for the state of Israel. Now, I want to make it clear, I wasn't an activist. I didn't actually become an activist until I went to university, David. Not really. I was always a Zionist. I was always pro-Zionist. My father had volunteered for a program during the Six-Day War where overseas volunteers tended to the farms of the soldiers who had gone out to fight, and he was one of those volunteers. Tended to the farms of the farmers who had gone out to fight, rather. He was one of those volunteers. My mother was a Zionist. The schools that I attended were always Zionistic. But I wasn't an activist because there was nothing to be activist against, right, or in defiance of. And all of that changed during my teens and certainly when I went to university. So my religious existence was a very difficult one, I would say. My fondness for Israel was very, very assured, and I'd be happy to talk about that if you want to know about it.
Yes, let's talk more about specifically the struggle with the faith and kind of how that intertwined with your love of Israel and the challenges that you faced when entering the university milieu.
Yeah, so the struggle with my faith came down to being susceptible to peer pressure, I think, really, is how I would boil it down. Because there was no Jewish high school in the town in which I grew up. There simply wasn't. And as I mentioned, I was an Orthodox Jew. And as an Orthodox Jew, that meant that I constantly felt different, not just to the non-Jewish students that I would be in high school with, but also my friends who were of the Jewish faith but were not Orthodox. That meant if I went to parties while everybody was chowing down on pizza and popcorn and snacks and cakes and who knows what, I would be there with a tinfoil wrapped lunch given there by my dear mother with whatever the kosher deli meat might have been and a packet of crisps that never looked as delicious as the packet of crisps that my friends would have. And I would always be there with a kippah, a yarmulke on my head, and nobody else had to wear a yarmulke. And so I always felt different. And I didn't want to feel different. I actually wanted to feel like everybody else. And that sense of being different made my religious life a challenge. Now, I was genuinely faithful and Orthodox right the way up until the age of about my bar mitzvah. And then I stepped away from it. Then I came back to it later on for my university studies, and I remained Orthodox all through my military service. Today, I define myself not as observant, but as religious, meaning I'm deeply, deeply defined and guided by the religious teachings of my father and of my mother and of my religion itself. But I'm not an observant Jew. And there are various reasons for that. Now, I said that that was a product of me wanting to blend in and be like everybody else. Obviously, when you grow up, you treasure your uniqueness. Obviously, when you grow up, you treasure your heritage. Obviously, when you grow up, you treasure the fact that you're part of something special. And I can tell you as an adult, I know that my life is enriched very much by the Jewish teachings that I was fortunate enough to be exposed to. Now, there was also another aspect to that, which was, as I've said many times publicly, that we fell prey to terrible anti-Semitism. So I don't know if everybody on this call knows this, but in Leeds, England, we were not able to walk around with a kippah on our heads in a public space because there was fear of anti-Semitism. My brother, for those who don't know, was severely, severely beaten, almost to death when he was 16 years of age because of an anti-Semitic attack. And then when I went to university, I saw rabid anti-Semitism masquerading as anti-Zionism at the university level. And I realized that there was actually institutional, systemic hatred towards the Jewish state and towards the Jewish people, and therefore towards me. And it didn't matter if I wore a kippah. It didn't matter what I ate for lunch. It didn't matter whether I adhered to the teachings of my mother and father or not. I was a target simply because I was Jewish, and the country that I viewed as my homeland, the state of Israel, was certainly a target at least as much as I was. And I was determined to act as best I could to defend both of those things, my people and my land, which I actually view inextricable one from the other, as best I'm able.
And so you did act. And can you walk us through the decision to join the IDF and what what it felt like to pull on that uniform?
Yeah, I definitely can. So that really starts when I was about 4 or 5 years of age. And I'll explain why, and I'll do it in short order because of time constraints. So before the World of Israel advocacy really came about, there was this tradition in the Jewish communities, including the community in which I grew up, to bring veterans of service of the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War, I believe those were the two wars, to spend a Shabbat in a community in Leeds, in Manchester, in London, and probably one or two of the other Jewish communities there. And it wasn't for fundraising purposes. It wasn't for them to go and speak at universities. It was just to build bridges between diaspora Jews and Israeli Jews. And I want everybody to understand a little bit about where I come from. It doesn't make me anything, but it's important you realize this. My grandfather on my father's side was the Av Bet Din. He was the head judge of the rabbinic court where I lived. He was a great Talmid Chacham, a very learned individual. He corresponded with people like Rabbi Moshe Feinstein and the Lubavitcher Rebbe and Soloveitch, a whole bunch of other people. And he was someone who had escaped from the Holocaust. Just prior to the events of the Holocaust, he left Germany. He was born in Poland, raised in Germany, got his rabbinic smicha in Germany, and then moved to the United Kingdom and started to work there just before the events of the Holocaust. His 4 sons all had an exceptional religious and secular education. They all became lawyers. One became a barrister, one became a magistrate, and the others were successful attorneys, criminal defense lawyers, or solicitors as they call them in the UK, including my dear father. So I had that upbringing. Within that upbringing, there was this transmitted notion that the recent story of the Jewish people, David, had been that Jews ran away from persecution. That began to change when we would have these Israeli veterans around the table. And I remember it, and I might be off a year or two, maybe I was 6 or 7 and not 4 or 5. But I remember very clearly that these Israelis would sit around our table and they looked sort of like my father, and they looked sort of like my uncle, and they looked sort of like I would imagine your father looks. And they were all professionals. They were doctors and lawyers. I knew what those were. And some were accountants. I knew what that was. And some were teachers. I knew what that was. And then in the midst of the conversation, they would say things like, I've got a bullet still lodged close to my heart, and it's so close to my heart that they're unable to operate, so it's still there. And then they'd make a joke. They say, so I set off metal detectors when I walk through them. Or someone would say that they had shrapnel from a detonation nearby embedded within their skulls. They would talk about their memories of war, but most importantly, they would talk about sacrifice in the pursuit of victory. Sacrifice in the pursuit of victory. And I remember sitting there and thinking to myself, just one moment. You're telling me that there's a bunch of Jewish men who are all accountants and doctors and lawyers and professionals, the same way that all of my father and his peers are. But these Jewish men, somewhere over there, in a place called Israel, not only fight, but they win. And they win in pursuit of a cause that I intrinsically knew was greater than any one individual. And I decided at a very young age, that's the kind of Jew that I want to be. That's what I wanted to be. I wanted to have the opportunities that my parents were able to afford me, but I also wanted the opportunity to fight, and I do mean fight, for that cause. So I wanted to go when I was 18 years of age. And indeed, I signed up at the age of 18, and I couldn't go, David. I delayed it. And the reason that I couldn't go was very straightforward. My brother, Jonathan, at that age, at the time that I was 18 years of age, was extremely unwell. Extremely unwell. His health was deteriorating as a result of the attack and the beatings that he took that I alluded to earlier, the anti-Semitic attack. And I don't know why, but I felt very strongly that it wouldn't be right of me to place my mother in a situation by my own choice, whereby she was worried about the life of her second son, and here's her third son running towards a battlefield, essentially, at least in my perception. And so I delayed it, and I said, I'll go to university. I had no interest in going to university, incidentally. I ended up having a wonderful time, but I did not plan to go to university. I said, I'll go to university, and if the desire to serve still burns thereafter, then I will go, and nothing will hold me back. And to come to the nub of your question, why did I decide to act on the desire? It's because I enrolled in my studies during the events of the Second Intifada. People will remember that was a wave of homicide bombings, innocent Israelis, Jews and non-Jews being killed, blown up, buses detonated, hotels, Sadarim being absolutely blown to pieces, people being killed and massacred in the course of undertaking the perfectly ordinary, just trying to live as Israelis. And in the UK, I saw that almost every tier of society campaigned to the detriment of the State of Israel and in opposition of the State of Israel, and stated openly that Israel was an illegitimate state and that it was the cause of its own distress and that it had no right to defend itself in the face of these terrible, terrible threats. And I realized that because that thought permeated the media and the academia, the realm of academia, and the students and the professionals and the elected officials, there was deep systemic hatred, unmasked hatred towards the State of Israel. And I became very much aligned with the cause of Zionism at that time. I realized there was only one place on earth, one place where I would be safe forever. And that place was and is the State of Israel. And when I say safe forever, I mean as a Jew. And as I always like to say, safe because I'm Jewish rather than in spite of the fact that I'm Jewish. And so what would happen, to take you behind the scenes a little bit, was that we would campaign on the Union steps. We were always outnumbered, but there were a number of brilliant campaigners there. I don't count myself among the number of brilliant campaigners. I remember the names of them. There was a guy, for example, named Yossi Senet, who won the physics prize at the University of Manchester. That's quite an achievement. He was a brilliant campaigner. And there were a number of others, as I say, but I was very, very engaged in it. And night after night, David, we would go back to one of our student digs, our student homes, and we would say, you know, the buses are being blown up and kids are being killed and Israelis are dying and we have to go and we have to serve and it's very, very important that we do so. And I said, yes, absolutely, we'll do that. We'll do it right after university. And then graduation, or rather the end of my studies came, because I didn't stick around long enough to actually go to graduation. I never went to my graduation ceremony. And I went. And nobody else did. And I felt very, very strongly when I was saying in that group of student campaigners, we have to go, that we had to mean it. And when the moment came where we had the opportunity to go and we finally graduated, nobody else went and served out of that nucleus. They've since moved to Israel, most of them, but they did so after the age that they were eligible for service, in some cases deliberately so. I didn't want to wait. I wanted to go. I wanted to act on it. And so one final note on that story is I had the opportunity to go to law school after that and to apply to law school. It's a very common career path in the UK. You do a BA in almost anything, you get a half decent grade and you can flip that to a law degree within 1 year and become a solicitor or a defense attorney or whatever you might want to be. And I decided on that path. This was my last, if you like, stand of opposition to my own wants and my own desires ideologically. And I decided upon that path and I put in my application, and it was a sure thing. Anybody could have gotten in to do a legal conversion course. And I remember feeling I'd given up on my dream of service, and I lay in bed one particular night, David, in streams of tears because I realized I'd given up on my dream. And the next day I woke up and I went down to the travel agent, as you had to do in those days, and I purchased a ticket. And I think a week later, I was on a plane to the State of Israel. And my goal was to serve. And my goal was to serve in a combat unit.
That's wonderful. And before we go there, before we walk through the service, I would just, before we walk through your service, I'd like to ask, or rather to invite you, I'm certain that there are people listening to this call who either are considering serving in the IDF themselves, or perhaps are parents of children who are considering it. And I'd like to give you the floor to sort of say what you would to them. What would you like to say to someone who'd come to you asking for advice on that question?
So my advice to them, though this may render me very unpopular with the parents on this call, is absolutely do it. And do it of your own volition. And most importantly, when making your decision to serve, understand the following. Number one, serve. Do not go over to the military, to the Israel Defense Forces in order to take. If you're going to the Israel Defense Forces in order to prove yourself, you will not find the opportunity to do that in the military if that's your motivation. If you're going over there because you want to embark on a great adventure, that's not a reason to go. If you want to go and give of yourself in service of a cause that is far greater than any single individual, then you must go. And I see and I meet time and time again individuals, David, who say to me, and they're right at the age of 17, 18, 19, 20, when I go and lecture in high schools or in universities, and they actually turn around to me and say, but my parents don't want me to. And I want to tell the individuals of that demographic, you must not live your life for your parents. You must live your life informed by the best teachings your parents gave you. But what the world actually needs is individuals who have fulfilled their ambitions, their goals, and who have stepped into their passions. Because the reality is, if you go in service, the same parents, in my experience, who will tell you don't go and will take away your credit card if you go, and you have to go to college before you go, and so on and so forth. If you go for the right reasons, and I've seen this on numerous occasions, those same parents who will say no will be the first parents and the proudest parents and the most outspoken parents when it comes to your swearing in ceremony at the Kotel, at the Wailing Wall, or at the top of Matzada, or at the end of your march for your beret. So go if your heart and your mind tells you to do so, and base your decision on two things. Base your decision on emotion, not logic. Logic is very overrated. There are an awful lot of great decisions that have nothing to do with logic, and the greatest things eventuate from them. Think about marriage and falling in love. If you were to try and express that on paper, it would be a difficult task to successfully complete. You just feel it and you know it and you understand it, and it's intrinsic and therefore it's right. And it's the same with service in the cause of the State of Israel. If you are one who feels it, go there based on your emotions. It may not be logical, but that doesn't mean it's not right. And when you're 85, 90, 100 years old, and you've got the mortgage paid off and you've got the kids and the grandkids, nobody's going to turn around to you and say to you, yeah, but you were 3 years late in getting married, or you had children 3 years later than is the average age. That's complete nonsense. All of those things will be waiting for you at the end of a great opportunity to serve in the defense of the State of Israel. So my words, and I hope I'm making this clear, are go and serve. It's very important. And the last point I would say is, a lot of the times people seek advice about these issues. Don't seek advice, seek experience. Experience is much more important than advice. Advice can often come with the best of intentions, but it largely means nothing. Look for the experience of people who've done it. I have done it. I would say to anybody, go and throw yourself into it. The feeling won't fade. It will only grow. It should grow as a feeling of accomplishment, not one of regret.
Okay. So let's follow your journey then. You've bought the ticket. You're flying to Israel. You step off the plane at Ben Gurion Airport to begin your journey as a lone soldier. What happens next?
Okay, so when I moved to the State of Israel, I didn't do it in an organized manner, right? So you can move to Israel as an Oleh Chadash, as a new immigrant. For those who don't speak Hebrew, when you move to Israel, you're said la'alot, to ascend, because spiritually it's called an ascent. And la'alot contains within it the root ayin lamed hey. And Oleh, therefore, is somebody who is ascending to the State of Israel, and Chadash is new. So I moved as an Oleh Chadash, a new immigrant, to the State of Israel. You can do that in a very organized fashion. I didn't have any time to wait. I described what made me move towards Israel earlier in the conversation. So I literally packed one suitcase and a backpack, and I flew. I got my papers there. I can't remember exactly where you get the papers. I believe you get some at Ben Gurion Airport. We're going back a good number of years, and then you have to go to Misrad HaPnim, the office that deals with all internal matters, to open a bank account and so on and so forth. But I didn't have anywhere to stay, and I didn't speak the language. And so I turned up literally at the doorstep of a friend of mine named Jeremy Lust. Jeremy was someone who was friendly with my roommate in university and was working as as a journalist for the Jerusalem Post, having made Aliyah himself. And he lived on Rehov HaPortzim, which is a beautiful, beautiful street in an area called Rechavia in Jerusalem. And I slept on his couch. And at the end of each week, he would say, Benjamin, I think it's time for you to move on. And I'd say, okay, I'm going. And he'd say, no, you can stay another week. I think he just wanted the company. And that went on for a number of weeks. And then my best friend from childhood, who remains my best and dearest friend today, as childish as that may sound, he really is, a fellow named Charles Mack, lived in an area a little bit further along. So Rehov HaPortzim wasn't in Rechavia. Rehov HaPortzim was in Katamon. And Charles lived in this place called Rechavia, just down the street from the Prime Minister's house, from Prime Minister Netanyahu's house, and also just down the street from the official residence of the Prime Minister, along Rehov Aza, which becomes Rehov Herzog. And one of his roommates was leaving because he was getting married. He suddenly had a room in his apartment that was available. Naturally, I was more than pleased to move in. And I enrolled for voluntary service in Magen David Adom, where I served for a couple of months after passing the course there. And I was living there in Israel, in Rechavia, thinking about how to get into the Israel Defense Forces. And I moved there beyond the age where you were permitted to serve. So the cutoff limit was age 23. I was 23 and a half or 24. And everybody said, you can't come in, you can't serve. And I said, listen, let me fill out the paperwork and let's see what happens. And I filled out the paperwork, and that's a continuation of the story.
Okay. And so you mentioned that you didn't speak the language when you arrived. What was it like joining a military that operated in a language that you did not speak?
So I didn't speak the language, but as I learned when I'd spent about 3 months in the United States of America, I was blessed with a British accent, and a British accent seems to be currency not only in the United States of America, but also in the state of Israel. So I thoroughly enjoyed my time in both of those countries, in the US and also in Israel. And obviously there's a large Anglo community, and it was fun and really a great time. It was a tremendous adventure. I had no money. I had no idea whether I was going to be accepted into the IDF or not. But I went down to what's called Lishkat HaGiyus, which is the drafting office, essentially, where nobody wants to work, right? Nobody wants to work. Nobody wants to process your papers. Nobody understands what you're doing in front of them beyond the age of eligibility for the Israel Defense Forces, begging them to let you in to the Israel Defense Forces. You are a strange bird over there in Lishkat HaGiyus when you stand there in a British accent, with a British accent, don't speak a word of the language, and you say, I want to serve in the Israel Defense Forces. They really don't quite know what you want from them. And I was successful, obviously. I put the papers in, the papers were processed, I was drafted, and then I got taken to a combat unit. Now, there were many lone soldiers who had specific ambitions for where they wanted to serve. I didn't care. I just wanted to be in a combat unit. I really didn't care if it was this branch or that branch or the other branch. I just did not want to be in tanks, because I didn't want to be in an enclosed area for my service. And I absolutely wanted to be in a fully fledged combat unit. And I remember going there and not speaking, as I said, a word of English, of Hebrew, not a word of Hebrew. I knew, obviously, shalom, todah, bevakasha, please, but nothing more than that. And I was out of my depth, quite honestly. And my captain and my class commander gave me a very clear ultimatum. They said to me, in 6 or 8 months, you're going up to the front. If you don't speak Ivrit by that time, you will not be taken forward. You will be moved out. You'll take a job somewhere in a non-combat position. And my class commander said to me, you are not allowed to speak any English during the day. What you are allowed to do is you're allowed to note down any words that you don't understand, which effectively meant noting down everything, David. And during Sha'at Tash, which was your free hour at the end of each day, you had 1 hour of free time. where you had to get various tasks fulfilled, but it was your hour essentially. You were allowed to ask one of the soldiers to teach you the words that you didn't understand. And it was just my good fortune that there were 2 or 3 soldiers in my class, in my tent. One was called Yossi Kaminsky, the other was called Yahel Gaver, and there was another one named Elad Reznik. And Elad Reznik, I think, had parents from South Africa or South Africa. And I would divide up my 1 hour in the following ways. I would spend a certain amount of time showering and cleaning up and making sure that my bed was ready for evening inspection. I would work out even beyond the rigors of the military training for about 15 to 20 minutes, along with another classmate named David. And I would then sit and open up the Pinkas, the book, and go through the words and really have the vocabulary drilled into me. And they were so gracious, they were so helpful. And they actually knew what they were doing, because after 3 months, I understood everything. After 6 months, I was speaking fluently, and I was more than ready to go forward when the time came. But I learned that technique, not just by it being imposed by my class commander and my captain, but also that's the way my father happened to learn Ivrit. And he still has a collection of small notebooks in which he writes down every word and studies them and learns them and works on them. And he actually has beautiful Ivrit as a consequence of that. My Ivrit is not beautiful, by the way. My Ivrit is quite gruff because it comes from the military. But it is the language of discourse in the state of Israel, and that's the one I enjoy speaking.
Now, throughout your service, you served in Hebron, and you served on Israel's northern border, and you served in some pretty hot spots. Can you talk us through how that has impacted you today, how you look back on that service, and to the degree that you can you tell us a little bit about those experiences?
Yeah, definitely. I just want to make one point that I neglected to make about the importance of the humbling experience of being bereft of the ability to communicate verbally. I had studied history, literature, and politics. Communication in the English language was never a challenge, and suddenly I was thrown into this dynamic where I did not know how to speak. It's very important to go through a humbling experience like that, to have to act rather than speak, to have to show it rather than tell it, right? And it's an interesting dynamic about vocabulary, because when one has a very rich vocabulary, one shapes that vocabulary around one's personality. But when you have a dearth of vocabulary, one's personality is shaped around one's vocabulary. So if all you can say is bevakasha, toda, slicha, please, thank you, excuse me, all of a sudden you become the most polite soldier in the entire unit. And of course that was far from the truth, but that's all that I had. And so I was forced to act and to show rather than to tell and to speak on something. And that was a very, very important lesson to me personally, and a lesson that I think is important for people to take on board themselves. If ever you can show something, it's always better than telling. In terms of my service and in terms of the lessons that I learned there, they're endless. I think as a man, and if I can just speak as a man, one of the things, and this may be a bit controversial, but I'll share it anyway. One of the things from which I think a lot of men specifically suffer is that in civilian life, rare is the opportunity to prove one's masculinity as one defines it for oneself. It's not a ready opportunity. So if you think back to the greatest generation, we hear about their tales of heroism and participation and storming the beaches of Normandy and so on and so forth. I don't know what all of these people did on the beaches of Normandy. I just know that these had a profound effect, these experiences, upon who they were as people, and it gave them a clarity of purpose. And I'm not comparing my experiences serving in the Second Lebanon War to the deeds of anyone else, much less the greatest generation. But I think the most wonderful luxury that service in the military gave me as a man, or as that type of man, was it helped to reduce, not get rid of, but reduce my ego and my need to prove who I was as a man, to prove what I could do as a man. And the absence of that need is probably the greatest luxury that I think one could have in this world, where you have this wonderful context that says to you time and again, when I was called upon, when I was asked to stand up, when I was asked to run forward, when I was asked to march forward, when I was asked to carry the injured, when I was asked to carry those who couldn't move anymore, when I was asked to go forward when it would have been easier to go backward, far easier to go backward, I answered that call. And I answered that call, and I wasn't unique for answering that call, but I did answer it. And that knowledge has really infused me with a fearlessness, not a bravado, that's something else, but a fearlessness. So if something is unknown to me, I don't worry about it. If I'm not sure how something is going to work out, I don't worry about it. If I'm a little bit unsure about what the outcome might be, I don't worry about it. What I say is, what is the purpose? What is the goal? Is anyone shooting at you? Okay, they're not. Kadima, get moving. Go towards whatever it is that you want to do. And look left and right if you want to. Look behind you if you want to. Ignore all of that, though, and keep moving forward and onwards towards whatever the objective is. That's the most important thing that I took from my service. Also, notions of friendship, of camaraderie, of brotherhood, of being willing to show one's weaknesses. Again, civilian life chastises the man who's willing to show his weakness. Military life doesn't. In the military, men regularly and often, great big strapping, masculine individuals, combat soldiers will regularly call one another motek, which means sweetie, essentially, or they won't end a phone call without saying "I love you." If they want to cry, they cry, and nobody judges them for that because everybody realizes that's just a part of who they are. I've never seen people cry with the tendency that I saw as a combat soldier, both for myself and for those soldiers that I had the privilege of serving next to. And the other thing is, I think I learned very importantly the clarity of purpose. This is very, very, very important in life, because when you get sent forward into Lebanon, which was the first war in which I served, and as far as I know, we were the first in, the deepest in, and the last out. And just to demystify that, that was because our soldiers, our brigade happened to be stationed in the northern parts of Israel at that time. So those are the ones that moved forward first. When you're at the forward operating position, David, and you can literally see, without any embellishment, the houses and the homes and the communities that you're defending and that are being rocketed, some of which are the domiciles of the soldiers you serve next to, you're able to contextualize the suffering you see in the field, the loss of arms and legs and life, and you're able to keep moving because you understand if you don't take your stand there, nobody else is going to. So that was another thing about it, clarity of purpose, because that's what actually wins wars and wins battle. And the last point I would say about it was the notion that Israel really is the only place that I can go. When I was in that war, there were a number of volunteers, and this in no way, shape or form is representative of all volunteers, soldiers from the United States. But there were a number of soldiers who did abandon. They went home, and they didn't go home because they were suffering from shell shock. They went home because their family's summer vacation was scheduled for when the Second Lebanon War was happening, and they wanted to go on vacation. And I believe there is no vacation in times of war. No vacation. It's a preposterous notion. You're there to serve, and you're there to give everything that you have in the defense of that which you hold dear. I felt that the European volunteers had a stronger conviction on the whole, in my experience. Again, there are fine, wonderful, dedicated US volunteers to the Israel Defense Forces. There really are. Some of them are our board members, and some of them are even on this phone call. But there was a tendency when the trouble really was hammered home for specifically those who abandoned to be Americans. And the reason I believe is because I think that American Jews understand that they can have a wonderful Jewish life, at least in 2006, this was the perception, back in Texas or in New York or in Los Angeles or wherever. That's not actually the lot of a French Jew who volunteers for service. It's not the lot of a Belgian Jew who volunteers for service. And it wasn't the lot of a British Jew who volunteered for service. And so the notion that Israel really was where everything was put into one basket for the future of my life and the Jewish people became very crystallized during war in a way that I don't think every Jewish community would be able to perceive and to understand.
That's a very interesting observation. Um, I want to talk more about kind of that U.S. Connection to Israel. I know you said that in your first undergraduate degree, you studied what we would call in the U.S. American Studies, and you've had this relationship with the United States for a while. You also, in your current position, work with the U.S. military. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your relationship with the United States. What brought you to study that as a student? Kind of what experiences did you have as a soldier, perhaps on training missions with the U.S. military? And what is your collaboration with the U.S. military like today?
Yeah, so in terms of what brought me to study that as a student, I'm sorry that it's not a more profound reason. It's that after I graduated from high school, my aunt and uncle, who live in a place called Westwood, California, which is where UCLA is, and it's just adjacent to Beverly Hills, kindly offered me to live with them and work there for a period of 3 months. And I was in the company of their youngest son, Jason, and Jason was a law student at the University of Southern California, also known, as I learned, he told me, also nicknamed the University of Spoiled Children, USC. And of course, I'm only joking when I say the fine institution. And we had a whale of a time for 3 months. I just became exposed to America. I became exposed to American Jews. I became exposed to the optimism of America and the promise of America. And I was in America without the identity of my father and my grandfather and all of the weight of the religious tradition and the community in which I'd grown up. And I had an opportunity just to explore myself and embark on wonderful adventures. And I wanted to get back to America at some point. And so this course actually had an opportunity that if you got your grades right and you could afford it, you could spend the second year in University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And that was it. That's why I did it. So I didn't really want to go to university. Again, I planned to go and join the IDF. I couldn't because of the reasons that I expressed earlier. But I thought I'll get back to America. That sounds like fun. And you can always do this law conversion course at the end, which is a very standard pathway, as I said. And that's why I did it. But I did become immediately enchanted by America and what America meant and what America represented and the sheer size of America and the scope of America and the can-do attitude of Americans and also the love of the Jewish people and the Jewish state that America very much embodied. It was unheard of for me that Jewish people could walk about with their kippot on their heads, and I saw them do that. It was unheard of for me that the non-Jewish community adjacent to the Jewish community knew Yiddish terms and engaged in eating Jewish food and Jewish cuisine, and it was a positive to be a member of the Jewish faith in America, in the America that I met at age 18, 19, whatever it may be. I think also I spoke about those soldiers who abandoned, but I also told you there were incredible American soldiers alongside whom I served and who completed their service and really were exemplary. And I felt that they were exemplary because they were Americans. And so when I came over to start to lecture in the United States of America, I realized that the connection between the US and the state of Israel had to be protected and had to be defended. And when I was lecturing here, it became immediately apparent to me, David, that all of the challenges that I faced when I was a student at university were now taking root and branch on American campuses. Now, when I said that at the time, people actually mocked me for doing that. I'm talking about now around 2007, 8, 9, somewhere right around there. People would say to me, they would be dismissive of them. They would say, Benjamin, this is not Europe, this isn't England. There is no issue of anti-Israel sentiment. There is no issue of anti-Semitism on campuses. Well, you fast forward to 2020, David, and barely a man or woman alive would suggest that there isn't an issue. And I perceived it, and I perceived it early and quick. And not because I'm a savant, I perceived it early and quick because I'd experienced it in the UK and I could see it being overlaid onto the campus dynamic in the United States. And I would say, you've got a problem here. And the students of today will be the policymakers of tomorrow. and they don't find favor in the story of Israel. And most alarmingly, there was a powering of this anti-Israel narrative and movement that came from Jewish students themselves. Now, I want to tell you why that's so particular to America. In Britain, the Jewish community does not have the size and scale to divide itself. It just doesn't have it. So they're obviously Orthodox, they're Reform, they're conservative, but most people define themselves as Orthodox even if they're not observant, you know? In America, you have this vast Jewish community, and this Jewish community has been really woven into the fabric of Americanism writ large. And as a consequence of that welcome, there's room for dissent and disagreement and discourse and debate in a way that there isn't among the Jewish communities of Europe. Tragically and unfortunately, many within the American Jewish community, not the majority, but many, have decided to turn their face against the state of Israel. And that was very, very prevalent on the campuses. And that's very dangerous because one of those voices, as I often say, is more potent than 1,000 voices of those who are not of the Jewish faith.
So just being aware of the limited time on this interview, I'd like to pivot perhaps to some questions that we've received ahead of time. Staying on this theme of the US, AIPAC, at least outwardly, presents itself as being totally apolitical and supportive of a strong US-Israel relationship irrespective of who's in office. But we have a direct question here from Bradford asking you, do you think Joe Biden would be a better choice for the US-Israel relationship than President Donald Trump?
Do I think that Joe Biden would be, can you repeat that question, please?
Do you think that Joe Biden would be a better choice for the US-Israel relationship than Donald Trump?
Do I think that Joe Biden would be a better choice for the US-Israel relationship than Donald Trump? Categorically not. And I want to explain why. It's only my opinion. And just before I go down this road, I want to make clear, I don't wade into the domestic conversation here about matters unrelated to the state of Israel. Okay, so I do not get into matters of, as I mentioned earlier, the composition of the Supreme Court, or whether a president should tweet or not, or whether a player should take a knee during the national anthem or not. I really don't get into that. On issues of Israel, I do, and I do so because I believe that it's only appropriate that I opine. And my view is that this is a complex situation. I'll explain. So first and foremost, President Donald Trump, whatever else may be going on with his presidency, in my estimation, has enacted policies that are exceptionally pro-Israel. And I want to make that clear for everybody. When you move the embassy of the United States of America to Jerusalem, that is a good thing for Israel, and it's a good thing for the Jewish people. When you recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights, that is a good thing for Israel, and it's a good thing for the Jewish people. When you have in situ an ambassador like Nikki Haley and now Kelly Craft at the United Nations who speak boldly in support of the state of Israel, that is a good thing for Israel, and it's a good thing for the Jewish people. And it's not just those actions that makes me say that Donald Trump has enacted policies that are tremendously pro-Israel. It's also, in my estimation, people who he has around him or had around him. Now, within his immediate circle, he had Nikki Haley, Jason Greenblatt, David Friedman, Jared Kushner, John Bolton, Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo, Steve Mnuchin. You go into the Senate and you think about Friends of Israel like Ted Cruz, Lindsey Graham. This is a who's who of bona fide supporters of the state of Israel. It's actually anomalous in the history of the US-Israel relationship, and I want to explain why. Because you could have that friendship circle, and you could have an administration back home in Israel that takes a completely different viewpoint and has a different worldview to the one as it relates to the state of Israel that is dominant within that group of names that I just mentioned, right? So if you had, for example, that group, Pence, Pompeo, Bolton, Trump, everybody else that I just named, and you had Ehud Barak as Prime Minister of the State of Israel, there would be a reb there somewhere. You don't. You have Prime Minister Netanyahu. So there's eye-to-eye alignment. That's an anomalous situation. By the way, once in a lifetime, probably will never come back again. It's complicated because a number of those who I've just named have actually fallen off and out of the administration. But there's still a great group there. And I don't know for how long they will be around. I don't know how long Secretary of State Pompeo will be around. I just don't know. None of us knows. But while they're there, I think that you're going to see a continued friendship from this administration to the State of Israel. Now, it could change, and I want to make everyone aware of this. If Donald Trump becomes a two-term president, and there's little reason to rely, for example, on funding from Sheldon Adelson, there's little reason to rely upon the evangelical support, there's less reason to rely upon the sources for votes that he's relied upon thus far, and for which I'm actually very appreciative, sources of votes and funding, which I applaud and I'm appreciative of. You may see a change in policy. You may see, as many presidents do in their second term, a move for an aggressive foreign policy implementation, and that might come with a number of questions and demands being made of the State of Israel. It could happen. I'm just gaming it out for you, David. I'm not saying it will. And the outcome of that will largely depend upon who is the Prime Minister of the State of Israel at that point. Remember, we have a Prime Minister, Bibi Netanyahu, who's there right now for ostensibly 18 months. I don't know if the person who succeeds Prime Minister Netanyahu will know how to deal with a President of the United States with the aplomb that Bibi's managed to do with successive presidents. So that's just a picture of the Trump administration. Now, Joe Biden, I'm afraid, would be on Israel, and I'm only going to speak about Israel, in my estimation, a continuation or worse of the policies of President Obama towards the State of Israel. Now, all of those things that I just made mention of were absent, in my view, with the Obama administration. He was not surrounded by great friends of the State of Israel. His right-hand man, Ben Rhodes, was adversarial towards the State of Israel. Rahm Emanuel, his chief of staff, was adversarial towards the State of Israel. Samantha Powers, his ambassador to the United Nations, was present and abstained from one of the most egregious UN resolutions, just as the Obama administration was moving out of office and the Trump administration was to take office. And there were tremendous demands made from the beginning, from the very beginning of the State of Israel by the Obama administration that led to a great degree of discord, overt discord between the US administration and the Prime Minister of the State of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. In addition to that, you had this tremendously problematic Iran deal that was viewed by most in the State of Israel as a disastrous deal that put Israel in a very precarious situation and that really flouted all of Israel's concerns when it came to its own security on an existential level. So that's my viewpoint. You're going to get more of that with a Joe Biden. I don't see any imagination coming to the fore. I don't see any new ideas coming to the fore. And I think it's very, very problematic, though not his fault necessarily, that Joe Biden has won the endorsement of J Street. Because J Street, though your question was grounded in AIPAC, J Street is an anti-Israel organization. There are many Zionists who are unwittingly members of J Street who actually don't realize the policies that J Street espouses, certainly not on campuses. And if they were aware of it, I believe that they would disenfranchise themselves from J Street. I don't want to see a return to Obama policies vis-a-vis the State of Israel. I think we need to move beyond the two-state solution. I think we need to come up with new ideas. And therefore, in my opinion, Joe Biden on Israel would be more of the same when it comes to President Obama's legacy, and it's not a positive legacy. Just to put that into context, the vast majority of Israelis felt very much that when President Obama was in the White House, there was an adversarial president in the White House, and it was a challenge, a daily challenge for Prime Minister Netanyahu to hold at bay that president. And I would encourage people to look at the record. So that's my answer to Bradford.
Okay, and So on that note, you mentioned that the two-state solution has proven itself to not be working thus far. We only have a few minutes left here, so I do want to challenge you to kind of very quickly and concisely explain what you call the new state solution. Um, and if you could just summarize that quickly, and on the heels of that, we have a question from Larry, which asks, what, if any, feedback have you received from Arab or Muslim friends, politicians, academics, etc., about the new state solution?
Yeah, so just in terms of time, let's you and I deal with this first and foremost. So nobody on this call is commuting anywhere. No one has to run home or anything like that. So I have a bit more time if you do. Do you have a bit more time, David?
I do, yeah.
Okay. So let's run the clock a little bit. It's now 8:10, 8:11. Let's go to 8:30, see where we are. And if people want to drop off the call, they can do. Hopefully they'll stay. My
Okay.
great powerful colleague, Alan, will let me know if people are falling away. But that will take us to a 90-minute total conversation. And I appreciate you keeping me in check, like you always do when I'm at Harvard Law School as well. So you're a great timekeeper. The new state solution marks me out as a rarity among the right of center in the state of Israel. So to put me in on the political spectrum, I'm right of center on security, probably left of center on social issues. I'm completely, totally, and utterly opposed, and forever will be, to the idea of the state of Israel ceding, and I want to be clear about this, an inch of land in order to create a home for another people. I think it's wrong, I think it's dangerous, I think it's detrimental, and I think it's beyond the remit of any leader of the one and only Jewish state. The mission statement of a leader of the state of Israel is to propel Israel forward to ever greater advancement, to safeguard it and to safeguard its people and to ensure its place among the nations. And I say that as a voter and a taxpayer and so on and so forth, and of course as a veteran. You could bring another Israeli on and they would tell you exactly the opposite, but you have the misfortune of interviewing me this evening, David. So that's my view. And I don't think that any Israeli leader has any right. I don't care what their military achievements, it's unimportant to me what their academic achievements, and it matters not what their legislative achievements are. I don't think any leader of the state of Israel has any right to talk about ceding land from an area which our people is in because we happen to believe it was sworn unto our forefathers by God. That's actually what the state of Israel is about. And I say that as an unobservant Jew. I've never lost sight of that, and I never will. And it would have been easier during the many years of my work to lose sight of that, to conveniently forget that. But I can't. It's an inconvenient truth for me. But as much as I'm of that viewpoint, I believe we have to resolve the Israel-Palestinian conflict. And I believe that we have to resolve it by way of establishing a state for the Palestinian Arabs that is truly independent, that is sovereign, that is viable, and that has the opportunity to succeed. I do not believe that that state should be established in Judea and Samaria. I do not believe that that state should incorporate East Jerusalem as its capital. I don't know how many people have read the Trump peace plan, but within the Trump peace plan, it actually says in writing that the Palestinian Arabs, as long as they meet certain criterion, can establish their capital in East Jerusalem and even call it Al-Quds. It's actually written there that they can call it Al-Quds. And I don't agree with that. I rail against that, and I always will do. I also don't think that you can give them a truly independent state. I think the only place that you can give them an independent state is actually in the Gaza Strip, which is de facto state as it is, with contiguity into the Sinai Peninsula. And if anybody wants to look at that, you can go onto the MirYam Institute, look at my writings, look at the writings of Brigadier General Amir Avivi, look at the writings of Brigadier General Shmuel Zucker, or Zvika Chaimovich, or Shachar Shohat, or Nehemiah Sokal, or Oded Gur-Lavi, and you will see that there is a real movement towards this. And if you want to see how that state would look, if you look at that map just behind me, David, you can see where my thumb is, that area, okay, that I'm circling with my thumb, that area would be where the new state would be in the Sinai Peninsula. And I think that anybody, and this comes right to the heart of what I fear would be the case. I'd be happy to be proven wrong, by the way, but what I fear would be the case if Joe Biden were to become president. I think there would be an immediate return to this notion of two states for two peoples living side by side by way of the two-state solution. And it's not implementable, it's not possible, it's not viable. And I think that anybody who champions that idea needs to be made to answer the following questions. Question number one, is it implementable? Can it be done geographically? How can you bring about a contiguous state for the Palestinian Arabs between Judea and Samaria on Israel's eastern flank and the Gaza Strip on Israel's western flank without bifurcating north from south Israel? My answer is you can't. You cannot do that. Question number two would be, is there proof and evidence and precedent that if this two-state solution is implemented, it's going to succeed? In other words, if you give further land, is there proof and precedent that that's going to result in a peaceful outcome with the Palestinian Arabs? Or does all of the evidence point to the very opposite? And I mention the Palestinian Arabs because it's that issue we have to deal with. I don't want people to say, well, look at what happened with Sinai. That was with the Egyptians. It's different. The third question would be, when you call for a two-state solution, are you calling for a truly independent state for the Palestinian Arabs, or are you offering them merely a sub-state that you yourself would not accept for yourself and for your people? And the fourth question, the penultimate question, would be, if you implement the two-state solution and it meets with failure, not with success, but with failure, as I contend it would you personally be willing to live with the outcome of that failure, the rockets and the terror and the danger, or do you bequeath that privilege only unto the people of Israel? And the final question would be, if you implement the two-state solution and it meets not with failure, not with success, but with failure, would you be willing to have your children live with the outcome of that failure? Or do you just bequeath that privilege unto the children of Israel? Because if the answer to all five of those questions isn't a resounding yes, you have to move on to another solution. You have to. And my solution, the solution that I've put forward, the solution that I've promoted with Rosita and with our working group, and I'm going to continue to promote, is the new state solution. I just want to say a word about how that came about because it's important. 2014, I got drafted into Operation Protective Edge. In 2009, there had been a draft of reservists. I wasn't called to that operation, but there had been a draft of reservists 2008, 2009 for Operation Cast Lead against Hamas in Gaza. 2012, another draft of the reservists in Operation Pillar of Defense against Hamas in Gaza. 2014, another draft, Operation Protective Edge against Hamas in Gaza. It is not acceptable to draft reservists every 2, 3, 4 years against the same enemy, the same lack of conclusion, with the same foreboding sense at the end of the operation that you'll be back there in another couple of years. Now, I'm a single man. I do not have a wife. I do not have children. The men alongside whom I served do have wives. They do have children. And if you're going to call them, they actually want to be called, but they want to finish the job. And the way that I would suggest you finish the job is you start to think strategically about what you actually want to achieve in the Gaza Strip. And I would say that what you want to do is completely destroy militarily Hamas, and it can be done, destroy them, not civilians, not citizens. I want to be very clear about that. Nobody I've served alongside would have any desire to take part in any operation that ever called for something like that, nor would such a command be given. But I think that everybody would like to see Hamas uprooted and destroyed. It's a terror organization. And you actually use that operation as the initial stages for building out the new state. So when you hear about Syria, one of the reasons people say we can't resolve the Syrian civil war is because there's no political endgame. I say make the new state solution the political endgame, and let's build that up. And let's create a state living side by side with the states of Israel that might not be at peace, but there's an absence of conflict. I believe it can be done. And just to up the ante here a little bit, I actually intend to get that done. I intend to get that done. I intend to get that built. I intend to get that as a central talking point on the conversation about Israel, so that every time someone raises his or her hands to espouse the virtue of two states, somebody else, maybe more, raise their hands and say, what about the new state? That's where the opportunity lies. And I'd encourage people to look at that and learn more about it. In terms of the Arab leaders, yes, we have had meetings. I can't go into too many details about those meetings, but I can tell you that we had numerous meetings with the administration, also with the campaign before President Trump became President Donald Trump. And we also met with Egyptians in the British Parliament who came over specifically to talk to us about that. And these were the right Egyptians. These were Egyptians who know the president and President Sisi, and were able to speak to his wants and his goals and his desires. And I can tell you there actually is a real appetite for the opportunity that might come about pending appropriate investment and pending appropriate security arrangements and so on and so forth by way of the new state solution. I will also tell you that academically, throughout the Western world, there's a real appetite for new ideas. Remember, most of your peers were not born when Oslo occurred. They were not born during the historic handshake, and if they were very, very young children. So they haven't grown up on the euphoria, the false euphoria, the unfounded euphoria of Oslo. And they never saw the historic handshake on the White House lawn between Rabin and Arafat. And they are part of a different movement. They're not a movement that's like you and me and Palestinian Arabs. They're not attached to the land over there. What they're attached to is ending conflict. Where you do it and how you do it, they're ready to hear more about that. So yes, the new state solution resonates with the people that we've spoken to, whether it be the administration, whether it be members of the Senate, members of the House, and certainly members of the Arab world. And we've met with them on several occasions.
Okay. Now, bringing it back to the theme of tonight's conversation, which is more personal, I'm going to combine two questions here. One is a question that was offered up by Nathan, and the other one is a question that I've had, actually. Nathan asks, which experience affected you the most in your role as a leader educating others to fight anti-Semitism around the world? And to supplement that, throughout the work you've done, I'm certainly you've had many offers to go into the private sector and perhaps make far more money doing something else. How do you motivate yourself to keep doing precisely this kind of work and keep working on these issues, which sometimes feel thankless? After all, I myself have had the unfortunate experience of seeing you and the very brave people that you brought to our campus attacked for the issues that they have. I know that it can be difficult. So what keeps you driving forward?
Well, can you repeat Nathan's question?
Nathan's question was, which experience affected you the most in your role as a leader educating others to fight anti-Semitism around the world?
So if I understand that question correctly, I think that the seminal event was actually my defiance of the advice, not the experience, dispensed to me in the best natured way by members of the community in which I grew up. And what I mean by that is that they would say to me, David, in the synagogue in which I grew up, in the community in which I grew up, there was a whole range of congregants. Some were very affluent, some were less affluent. Some were very learned academically and some less so. Some were in business and some were in professions. And it always, or very often, seems to be that the Zionist voice within synagogues is oftentimes handed over to those who are very affluent, right? Because they're making very generous donations to the state of Israel, for which we're very grateful. And so I tended to gravitate towards them when asking them, should I go and serve, right? It was the successful businessmen and the successful professionals. And I would walk home with them because, as I said, I was an Orthodox Jew. So I'd walk home with them every Shabbat for about 45 minutes. I would say, should I go and serve? None of them had served. And down to the last, they would say, do not go. You mustn't go. They don't need you there. You can make more of a contribution by becoming a lawyer, which, as you know now, was the path that I was more or less on. I hadn't formalized it, but I was certainly on that path. And you can make donations and you can be an activist here. But it was the first part of their answer that really troubled me. They would say they don't need you. They have enough soldiers. And I think that the most important lesson I took from my service, and I'm going to bat away the premise of being a leader. I'll just talk to you about my service. I think it was the realization that, yes, somebody else can take your place. If you're not going to be the heavy machine gunner, they will find somebody else to be the heavy machine gunner. But in any fight in life, in any situation in life, only you can undertake your task in the way that you can uniquely undertake it. Only you. There is no substitute for you. There is no substitute for your personal convictions, your personal courage, your personal weaknesses that you overcome, your character, your humor, your personality, whatever it may be. Only you can do something in the way that you can do it. And I think that when it comes to fighting back against anti-Semitism, it's very easy to do what those advisors would say to me. It's easy to write a check to an organization. It's easy to attend a conference. It's easier. But if you act and you engage, yeah, perhaps somebody else would have acted and engaged in your stead, but nobody will be able to do so in the way that you can uniquely do it. And that's why I encourage people to go forward and to serve and to turn into a problem and never turn away from a problem, especially when it's a problem that is not personal in nature. If it's a problem that exists in the context of a cause, and what better cause than a Jewish cause, and what better Jewish cause than the safety and security of the state and the people of Israel, don't turn away from it, turn into it, and understand that in doing so, you'll be the right person in the right place at the right time, doing the right thing for the right reason, in the way that only you can possibly do it. So I think that's really the most important message that I learned. And it certainly has informed my service in the Israel Defense Forces, and it's certainly informed the tasks that I'm privileged to undertake by way of Our Soldiers Speak for so many years, and now the MirYam Institute, which we're going to continue to build. Did you feel that I answered that question?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
And your question?
And my question is, when the times get tough, when you're on the ground at various campuses, what motivates you to keep going instead of taking a private sector job?
I think I'm very, very fortunate in terms of my aspirations, my personal aspirations, to again take the example of my mother and my father. My mother is a lady who I don't think wears any jewelry. I don't remember her ever going to a nail salon. I'm not indicting the ladies who do go to nail salons. It's wonderful if that's your thing. I don't remember her ever being a consumer of high fashion or haute couture or any such thing at all. I really don't remember her. My father as well, though he did have some years of success as a criminal defense attorney, he was never into material things. He never drove expensive cars. He never dressed in extravagant outfits. He just wasn't that kind of a person. We weren't raised to pursue that. We were really a family that valued service. Really, we were. My father, for example, one of the things that he did was he was a criminal defense attorney during the week, a chazan during Shabbatot and during the high holy days and so forth. And every penny for many, many years that he earned, he would donate to charity. Every penny that he earned as a cantor, as a chazan, he would donate away. People didn't know that, but he did. My uncles were all deeply dedicated to service. My grandfather was deeply dedicated to service. And I actually did make the misstep of trying to force myself into an opportunity where I would gain wealth. I did that because I'm not from a wealthy background at all. And so, for example, when I was at university, I had to intercalate between year 2 and year 3 and go and work in order to earn enough money to complete my studies. That was just my reality, and I never begrudged that, and that's how it was. But I remember getting a job at one point as a salesman. I was a salesman for a company called Minor Planet. And Minor Planet was on the forefront of vehicle tracking technology. They would put one of these vehicle trackers beneath the hood of a car, and the owner of the fleet of trucks or cars or vans or whatever it may be could track where that car was and keep their costs down. And I was made a salesman there because there was a very generous Jewish philanthropist in Leeds named Jeffrey Morris who would give a job to any Jew who needed a job, and I certainly needed a job. And I'll never forget his kindness. And I worked there as a salesman. David, they gave me a company car. That company car was a Mercedes. They paid for my phone bill. Cell phones were a luxury back then. They were not what they are today. They gave me an expense account to buy clothes, and so I wore all of the nice shirts and whatever else you wear. And I felt dead on a daily basis. I never sold a single unit. You have to understand, these units were flying off the shelves. They really were. And within the space of a couple of years, this company was multinational. It was in Australia, in the US, in England, and all over Europe. And I'm there, and I couldn't sell a single unit. And the reason that I couldn't sell a single unit is because all of the incentives that were put before me, £1,000 if you sold X number, a better car if you sold Y number, they left me cold. They left me dead. I was uninterested in that. I wanted to feel part of a cause greater than myself. And in actual fact, whenever I would have to go into work, I remember all those years ago driving up to the car park at 8:45 in the morning for a 9 o'clock start and sitting in that car park and having to force myself and will myself and steady myself in order to walk in to what was ostensibly a very positive financial opportunity for me. And I managed to get myself in there, but I arrived late. It was difficult. I was uninspired and uninspiring. And I think in terms of the private sector, I actually think that service in the military in Israel is very much like falling in love. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. There are people who marry because they fall in love, and there are people who marry because they feel it's time to get married, right? Obviously nobody in this call, but it does exist. And I think once you've been in love, it's very, very difficult to imagine a lifelong union with somebody with whom you're not in love. And to just be pragmatic about it and get on with it. And the reason for that is because you know love exists, you know it's out there. And if it came and it slipped through your hands, as they say, better to have loved and lost than to not have to not have loved at all. Better to have loved and lost than to not have loved at all. And once you've had it, you can't just act as though it doesn't exist. And it's the same with fulfillment in terms of your professional endeavors. I came from the United Kingdom. I couldn't wear a kippah. I couldn't outwardly demonstrate my Judaism. I wasn't always proud in my Judaism during my childhood years. That went, and I became very, very proud, obviously, as a teen and as a young adult and as a student. But only when I stood in uniform did I become awash with a sensation that I actually think eludes most men all the days of their lives. And that sensation was, as I looked at myself in the drafting office in the uniform of the Israel Defense Forces, I'm exactly the right person in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, doing exactly the right thing for exactly the right reason. And there is an absolute final reconciliation between my outward appearance and my inner beliefs. And when you become awash with that sensation, now you know it exists. Now you know it exists. Now you know that you can be engaged in work that absolutely fulfills you, that absolutely completes you, and that you're going to be good at because of that. And I'm not going to find that sensation working in the private sector. I won't be good in the private sector. I won't be successful in the private sector. I won't bring passions to my job in the private sector. My passion is here. My passion is Israel. It always will be. And it's in service of that I plan to continue all the days of my life, as long as there's breath in my lungs. So I suppose that's really the answer. And if I could leave with this comment, I would tell the younger people who listen to this, the world needs happy Jews. It needs happy, fulfilled Jews. There are a lot of Jewish lawyers, and there are a lot of Jewish accountants, and a lot of Jewish doctors and educators. And please God, David, you're going to be an incredible ambassador of the Jewish people and of the legal fraternity and profession when you become a lawyer. And I know that you'll apply a portion of your talents to Israel and the Jewish people always. I know that, and I know you're already doing it. But if it doesn't fit, if it's not right for you, pursue that which does make you happy, because you will make a living. I will not know riches through my work in the nonprofit sector, but I have a board that takes care of me. I have donors who take care of me, who have given me the ability to live and to earn a living, and I feel privileged for that. And riches is not what I'm pursuing. It's wealth and value by way of the undertakings that I'm privileged to have. And as they say in Pirkei Avot, who is a wealthy man? Ish samech bechelko, a man who is happy with his lot. And I'm happy with my lot. And I thank the people who enable me to do it. And paramount among those people, of course, is Rosita, who, if we had more time, I'd tell you much more about. But that's the reason why it's difficult. Once you know about fulfillment, very, very difficult to turn away from it.
Well, Benjamin, you and I have had many really excellent conversations over the years. And I think this one especially has just been, for me at least, and I think for all of our viewers, inspiring and motivating and really exciting to get a peek into what drives you and what has sort of made the MirYam Institute what it is. Our goal when we spoke was to have a real sichat nefesh, a conversation of the soul, when we talked this evening. And from where I sit, at least, I think we've done that. And it's been a real pleasure to be witness to you telling your story. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, David. Thank you for everything you do. And I want to just say thank you to my board and to our supporters and our investors. And I want to thank Rosita, and I want to thank Alan, and I want to tell all of you, however difficult this period may be, it will pass. You will pass it. And when you do pass it, I'm absolutely confident that all of you can come out of it on the other side stronger than ever, full of vigor and rigor, and ready to attack all of the challenges that lay in wait, but are there, of course, to be overcome. Thank you so very much, David, and thank you to everybody who joined us on this webinar. I'm very appreciative of the time of all of